My name is Chris Gates, and I'm going to present a basic introduction to aggregate SQL queries. By the end of this introduction, you should be able to describe what an aggregate query is and when you would use it. You should be able to describe and list a few aggregate functions. You should be able to explain how an aggregate query is executed and write a basic aggregate query. Let's focus on the survey table that was introduced in earlier lessons. Here's a query that returns all rows from the survey table. I'll introduce what these columns mean as we go along. For now, I'll just mention that each row represents a specific measurement, the value of the reading column, at a specific site, the value of the taken column. You can see from the quant values that this table contains several different kinds of readings: temperature, salinity, and radiation. Let's say I want to focus on the temperature readings. I can add a where clause to this same query to filter the rows to only those measuring temperature. In this query, and the one just before, every row in the result represents a row from the table. This is great when we need details on specific rows. An aggregate query answers a different kind of a question. An aggregate query summarizes a set of rows as a single row. For example, we could ask, how many temperature readings do we have? Here is the appropriate aggregate query. This aggregate query summarizes a set of rows, these rows, as a single row, this row. Here, count is an aggregate function. An aggregate function summarizes a set of values as a single value. In this example, the count aggregate function summarizes this set of values as this value. Let's look at another example. Let's say that I want to know what was the average temperature reading. Just looking at the question, I know I need an aggregate query because I'm looking for a single value, the average temperature, and to get it I have to summarize the set of all temperature readings. So we need an aggregate function, and specifically we need the average function. The SQL looks like this. Select the average of reading values from the survey table, filtering to include only the temperature readings. If an aggregate function appears in the select list, the database will perform an aggregate query and summarize the results. So it's worth knowing that count, average, min, max, and sum are the most common aggregate functions. There's a handful of others, and you can really look those up as you need them. I want to work the same example one more time and focus on how the database manager actually executes this aggregate query. The database manager executes this query in 4 steps. First off, it sees the aggregate function average in the select list, so it knows it's an aggregate query. The database then transforms the original query by removing the aggregate functions and executing this simpler query. This new query will return all the original values, like this. The database feeds this set of values to the average function, and finally it returns the summary value from the average function. Given the handful of aggregate functions listed above and a good understanding of how the queries are executed, you can create and interpret more complex aggregate queries. For example, I can extend this query to answer a more complex question. Let's say I want to know the count of all temperature readings, but I also want to know the average temperature reading and the maximum temperature reading. First, the database sees the aggregate functions. Second, it transforms and executes the simpler non-aggregate query. It feeds the set of values to the aggregate functions. And finally, it returns the summary value from each function. Now it's worth pointing out, from the execution model, you can see that the from and where clauses are evaluated first, and when they're completely done, they feed their results to the aggregation functions. Because they are executed in that order, you cannot put an aggregate function in the where clause. It won't work. You'll just get an error. And as these examples suggest, you generally see aggregate functions in the select list, or sometimes the order by clause. In review, an aggregate query is used to summarize a set of rows as a single row. These queries use aggregate functions. Aggregate functions accept a set of values and emit a single value. They appear only in the select or order by clauses. Count, average, min, max, and sum are all examples of aggregate functions.